Ma'am, you don't belong in first class. Pick up your bag and head to economy before I have you removed. Captain Daniel Foster's voice sliced through the quiet cabin with the confidence of a man who had never expected anyone to question him. Conversation stopped. Coffee cups paused halfway to waiting lips. Even the soft hum of the aircraft suddenly felt distant as every passenger turned towards seat 2A. There sat Naomi Brooks, a 45-year-old black woman wearing a charcoal hoodie, dark blue jeans, clean white sneakers, and a simple canvas backpack resting beneath her legs. There was nothing flashy about her appearance. No luxury handbag, no diamond jewelry, no designer logo demanding attention. She looked like someone who preferred comfort over recognition, and to Captain Foster, that was all the evidence he believed he needed. Naomi slowly lifted her eyes to meet his without the slightest trace of anger. She didn't rush. She didn't argue. She didn't even stand. Her calm unsettled a few nearby passengers far more than shouting ever could. The captain folded his arms. "Did you hear me?" he asked, louder this time. "First class is reserved for paying premium customers." A middle-aged white businessman across the aisle smirked before whispering to his wife. "Looks like somebody wandered into the wrong cabin." A few quiet chuckles drifted through the rows. Others simply watched, unsure whether they were witnessing a misunderstanding or something much worse. Naomi glanced once at the boarding pass resting neatly on her lap before looking back at the captain. "Would you please verify my ticket?" she asked in a steady voice that carried no fear and no apology. Captain Foster barely looked at the document. "I don't need to. I know what belongs here, and I know what doesn't." The words lingered in the air, heavier than the engine noise outside. Flight attendant Emily Carter, only 6 months into her career, stood several rows behind them with the beverage cart frozen in place. She remembered scanning every boarding pass during pre-boarding. She remembered seat 2A turning green on her handheld device. She remembered the name Naomi Brooks appearing exactly where it should have been. Yet now she watched her captain dismiss all of that without checking a single detail. Emily opened her mouth for a moment, then quietly closed it again. Around the cabin, phones remained tucked away, but curious eyes multiplied by the second. A retired teacher sitting near the window frowned. A young college student wearing headphones quietly slipped one earbud out, sensing something important unfolding. Naomi rested one hand lightly over her boarding pass, as though protecting nothing more than a piece of paper, though the calm in her posture suggested she was guarding something far greater. She had seen this expression before. She had heard this certainty before. Different airport, different decade, same assumption. She knew exactly how quickly strangers could decide where someone belonged simply by looking at them. Captain Foster stepped one pace closer. "I'm only going to ask one more time." His tone remained polished enough to sound professional, yet every word carried the weight of a conclusion he had already reached. Naomi breathed slowly, her expression unchanged. Outside the oval window, the late afternoon sunlight reflected across the runway, painting the aircraft in warm gold, while inside the cabin the atmosphere grew colder with every passing second. No one realized that the flight they thought was about to depart for New York had already begun a very different journey, one that would challenge every assumption sitting comfortably inside first class. Naomi Brooks lowered her eyes to the boarding pass for only a second before placing it gently on the armrest beside her. There was no trembling in her hands, no hurried explanation, no desperate attempt to convince anyone that she belonged. She simply looked back at Captain Daniel Foster with the same composed expression that had unsettled him from the beginning. "I purchased this seat," she said quietly. "If there is a concern, I would appreciate it if someone would verify the information instead of making assumptions." Her voice never rose above a normal conversation, yet every nearby passenger heard every word. Captain Foster gave a dismissive smile that never reached his eyes. "I have flown this route for nearly 20 years, he replied. "Experience tells me everything I need to know." Naomi nodded once, almost as if she had expected exactly that answer. She leaned back against the leather seat instead of standing, her posture relaxed enough to make the silence around them feel even heavier. Emily Carter could not stop thinking about the boarding process. She remembered greeting Naomi at the aircraft door less than 20 minutes earlier. The scanner had flashed green. Seat 2 Alpha had appeared beside Naomi Brooks' name with no warnings, no restrictions, and no special notes except one small symbol Emily had never seen before. At the time, she assumed it belonged to the airline's executive travel program, but she had been too busy welcoming passengers to ask questions. Now that forgotten detail quietly returned to the front of her mind. Across the aisle, the businessman who had laughed earlier crossed his arms. "This is delaying everybody," he muttered loudly enough for several people to hear. His wife glanced toward Naomi before looking away again, suddenly less certain than she had been a moment earlier. 2 rows behind them, a young woman wearing a university sweatshirt whispered to her friend, "She is not even arguing." Her friend answered softly, "That is what makes this feel strange." Another passenger slowly lowered the magazine he had been reading, unable to ignore the growing tension filling the premium cabin. Captain Foster extended his hand toward Naomi's boarding pass without asking permission. She calmly picked it up before he could reach it. "I will gladly hand this to someone willing to verify it," she said. "I will not hand it to someone who has already decided the outcome." The words landed with surprising force. There was no accusation in her tone, only quiet certainty. Emily took one cautious step forward. "Captain," she began carefully, "if you would like, I can check the passenger manifest again." Daniel Foster turned toward her immediately. "There is no need." His response came so quickly that Emily felt her confidence shrink. "I have already handled the situation." She looked from the captain to Naomi and then toward the closed cockpit door, unsure whether following orders and following the truth were still the same thing. Naomi noticed the hesitation in the young flight attendant's face. She offered Emily a small, reassuring smile that seemed almost out of place in the middle of such an uncomfortable moment. It was the smile of someone who had learned long ago that another person's integrity often needed encouragement more than pressure. Outside the aircraft windows, baggage crews continued their routine beneath the fading afternoon sun, while passengers still boarded through the forward door, unaware that the greatest delay had nothing to do with luggage or weather. Inside the cabin, assumptions had begun moving faster than facts. Captain Foster straightened his uniform jacket and spoke with renewed confidence. "If you refuse to cooperate, airport security will make the decision for you." Naomi slowly folded her boarding pass and placed it inside the front pocket of her backpack. Then she looked directly into his eyes once again. "I have no intention of causing a scene," she said. "I simply believe every decision deserves to be based on the truth." For reasons she could not yet explain, Emily suddenly felt that those words would matter far more before this flight was over than anyone in the cabin could possibly imagine. The quiet confidence in Naomi Brooks' voice did not calm the cabin. Instead, it seemed to divide it. Passengers who had been silently watching now began exchanging uneasy glances, each reaching a different conclusion about what they were witnessing. Some believed the captain was protecting airline policy. Others wondered why a simple ticket verification had turned into a public confrontation. A young man seated 3 rows back slowly lifted his phone and began recording without saying a word. He was careful to keep the device low, but the small camera lens pointed directly toward the front of the cabin. Within seconds, another passenger noticed. "Someone should document this," she whispered to her husband. "Just in case." The businessman across the aisle shook his head in frustration. "People record everything these days," he said loudly. "The captain is only doing his job." His comment earned a quiet nod from one passenger and an uncomfortable silence from several others. Emily Carter stood frozen beside the service galley, watching the situation grow beyond anything covered during her training. She had been taught how to respond to turbulence, medical emergencies, and delayed departures. Nobody had explained what to do when facts and authority no longer seemed to agree. She quietly reached for the electronic passenger manifest on her company tablet. Her fingers hesitated for only a moment before entering seat 2 Alpha. Naomi Brooks. Confirmed. Premium fare. Cleared for boarding. Every detail matched perfectly. Then Emily noticed the same unfamiliar symbol beside Naomi's profile. Curiosity overcame hesitation. She selected the icon, expecting a routine note. Instead, the screen displayed a message requiring executive authorization. Emily immediately locked the tablet and looked back toward Naomi with growing uncertainty. Captain Daniel Foster had not noticed. His attention remained fixed on the passenger sitting calmly before him. "This delay has gone on long enough," he announced so that the entire cabin could hear. Airport security has been notified. Several passengers shifted nervously. Nobody wanted a flight delayed. Nobody wanted unnecessary conflict. Yet the atmosphere had changed. The confidence many had placed in the captain was slowly giving way to doubt. If verifying a boarding pass would take only seconds, why refuse to do it? Naomi remained perfectly still. She folded her hands together and rested them in her lap. She did not look toward the passengers who whispered about her. She did not react to the phone recording her every movement. Her attention remained on Captain Foster alone. Years earlier, she might have felt the pressure of dozens of strangers judging her appearance. She might have rushed to prove herself. She might have apologized simply to make everyone else comfortable. Those years were long behind her. Experience had taught her that dignity never required permission. Emily took another careful step forward. "Captain," she said softly enough that only those nearby could hear. "Perhaps headquarters can clarify the reservation before security arrives." Daniel Foster barely turned his head. "There is nothing to clarify," he replied. "Some people count on others being too afraid to question them. I am not one of those people." The sentence lingered over the cabin. Ironically, it described someone very different from the person he believed he was confronting. Naomi slowly reached into the side pocket of her backpack. Several passengers leaned forward, expecting another boarding document. Instead, she removed nothing more than a slim leather notebook and placed it on the empty seat beside her without opening it. Her movements remained deliberate and unhurried, almost as though she were allowing everyone around her one final opportunity to choose fairness over assumption. Outside, the aircraft doors remained open as the last rays of sunlight reflected across the runway. Inside, every passing minute deepened the divide between certainty and truth. Emily lowered her eyes briefly before making a quiet decision of her own. Without drawing attention, she stepped back toward the galley, unlocked her company tablet once more, and opened the internal directory. If answers were not going to come from inside the cabin, she would find them somewhere else before the next irreversible decision was made. Emily Carter stepped behind the service curtain with her company tablet held close against her uniform, careful not to attract attention. Her pulse was faster than she wanted to admit. Every instinct told her to follow the captain's instructions without question, yet every fact on her screen told a different story. She opened the internal employee directory and entered Naomi Brooks into the search field. For a brief moment, nothing happened. Then the screen refreshed, displaying a restricted profile that required elevated authorization. Before Emily could close the page, a notification appeared across the top of the display. Executive travel status. Contact corporate operations immediately before any seating adjustment. Emily stared at the message in disbelief. She read it twice, then a third time, hoping she had misunderstood. She had never seen a travel profile carry instructions that specific. She looked back toward the front of the cabin where Naomi remained seated with remarkable patience, while Captain Daniel Foster stood firmly convinced he was protecting airline policy. Emily quietly selected the Emergency Corporate Support Directory instead of Airport Operations. The call connected after only 2 rings. "Corporate Operations," a calm voice answered. Emily lowered her own voice. "This is Flight Attendant Emily Carter on Flight 721. I need to verify a passenger profile before a seating dispute escalates." The representative requested the reservation number. Emily read it carefully. Silence followed for several long seconds as keyboard clicks echoed through the speaker. Then the representative asked a question that immediately changed Emily's expression. "Has Ms. Brooks been treated with courtesy?" Emily hesitated. She glanced toward the front of the aircraft once again. Captain Foster was still speaking, explaining to several passengers that airline procedures required cooperation, even though no one had actually verified the boarding pass. Emily swallowed carefully before answering with complete honesty. "There has been disagreement." Another pause followed. This one felt heavier. "Remain where you are," the representative replied. "Do not remove that passenger from her assigned seat. I am notifying executive operations now." The line disconnected before Emily could ask another question. She lowered the tablet slowly, her thoughts racing. Executive operations did not become involved over ordinary reservation questions. Something far more significant was unfolding, yet she still did not know exactly what. Across the cabin, the tension continued to spread from row to row. The young passenger recording the encounter quietly sent the video to a friend with a short message asking whether the situation looked as uncomfortable to others as it did to him. The retired teacher watched Naomi with growing admiration. She had spent 30 years in classrooms teaching children that respect began with listening before judging. Watching an adult refuse to follow that lesson troubled her more than the delay itself. Naomi sensed eyes following every movement she made, but she remained focused on her own breathing. She had learned long ago that silence often revealed more about other people than arguments ever could. Every impatient glance, every whispered assumption, every confident conclusion added another layer to a story that was writing itself without her assistance. Captain Foster checked his watch before addressing the cabin again. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. This matter will be resolved shortly." His confidence sounded unchanged, but Emily noticed something different. For the first time since the confrontation began, several passengers no longer nodded in agreement. They simply watched him. Questions had begun replacing certainty. Emily walked toward the front with measured steps, stopping just behind the captain. She chose her words carefully, knowing every sentence mattered. "Captain," she said quietly, "corporate operations asked that no seating changes be made until they complete a verification." Daniel Foster frowned. "Corporate operations?" he repeated. "Why would they be involved?" Emily met his eyes for only a moment. They did not explain. They only said the passenger should remain exactly where she is. Captain Foster looked toward Naomi Brooks, then back at Emily. For the first time that afternoon, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face, almost too brief for anyone else to notice. Naomi observed the exchange without speaking. Deep inside, she recognized the moment for what it truly was. The truth had finally begun moving, and once it started, no assumption in that cabin would be strong enough to stop it. Captain Daniel Foster stared at Emily Carter for several seconds, as if waiting for her to admit she had misunderstood the message. "Executive operations does not interrupt boarding over routine seating disputes," he said with controlled confidence. Emily answered carefully, "That is exactly why I thought you should know." Neither of them noticed that several passengers had stopped pretending not to listen. The businessman across the aisle quietly lowered his newspaper. The retired teacher leaned slightly toward the aisle. Even the college student recording the encounter no longer focused only on Naomi. The attention of the cabin had shifted toward the captain himself. Naomi Brooks remained perfectly composed, her hands resting loosely on the closed leather notebook beside her. She had not looked at her watch once since the confrontation began. Time was no longer important. Character was. Captain Foster finally exhaled. "Very well," he said. "We will wait for their call, but this changes nothing." Naomi met his eyes without hostility. "Sometimes waiting changes everything," she replied softly. Those few words settled over the cabin with unexpected weight. As silence returned, Naomi's thoughts drifted somewhere she had not visited in years. More than 2 decades earlier, she had stood alone in another airport wearing an inexpensive department store suit she had saved for months to buy. She had just earned a scholarship to attend a leadership conference that she believed would change her future. Instead of congratulations, she had been greeted by suspicious glances, repeated questions about whether she belonged in the priority boarding line, and quiet conversations that stopped whenever she looked in their direction. She still remembered sitting alone after that flight, wondering whether success would ever be enough to erase assumptions made before she even spoke. That young woman had promised herself something during those difficult hours. If she ever reached a position of influence, she would build places where respect came before appearances. She never forgot that promise. Years later, it had shaped every executive decision she made. Back in the present, Emily's company tablet vibrated once. She discreetly looked at the screen. A new internal message had arrived. Executive response team activated. Maintain current passenger seating. Additional personnel en route. Emily felt the air leave her lungs. Additional personnel were coming directly to the aircraft. This was no longer a simple customer service matter. She looked toward Naomi again, searching for any sign of surprise, but there was none. Naomi simply sat with the quiet patience of someone who already understood how the next chapter would unfold. Captain Foster noticed the notification reflected briefly in the tablet screen. "Another update?" he asked. Emily nodded. "Yes, Captain. What does it say?" She hesitated for only a moment before answering truthfully. Executive personnel are coming to the aircraft. His expression tightened. Executive personnel, he repeated. For this. Emily could only answer with a small nod. The confidence that had filled his voice throughout the afternoon no longer sounded quite as certain. Around the cabin, whispers returned, but their tone had changed. Earlier, passengers had questioned Naomi. Now they questioned the situation itself. Why would corporate executives become involved before departure? Why had no one verified the ticket from the beginning? Why did the quiet passenger appear less anxious than everyone else? The businessman who had mocked Naomi shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His wife folded her hands together and looked toward the window, avoiding eye contact with anyone nearby. The retired teacher smiled faintly, sensing that Patience was about to reveal something pride had hidden. Naomi slowly reached into her backpack once more. This time she removed her phone, unlocked it with a single touch, and glanced briefly at one incoming message. She did not type a reply. She simply pressed one button and lifted the phone to her ear. "Good afternoon," she said calmly. "I am still in seat 2 Alpha. Yes, everything is proceeding exactly as expected. Thank you." The call lasted less than 10 seconds. She slipped the phone back into her bag as quietly as she had taken it out. Nobody knew who had been on the other end of that conversation. Nobody understood why such a short exchange had left Naomi looking even more at peace than before. But somewhere beyond the aircraft door, events had already begun moving in a direction that no one inside the cabin could see, and within minutes, every assumption made that afternoon would be forced to confront the truth. Naomi Brooks slipped her phone back into her backpack as though the brief conversation had been nothing more than a routine travel update. She folded her hands once again and waited without the slightest hint of impatience. The stillness around her stood in sharp contrast to the growing uncertainty spreading through the cabin. Captain Daniel Foster checked his watch for what felt like the 10th time. Departure was now running behind schedule, and every passing minute invited more questions than answers. He prided himself on maintaining control, yet control felt noticeably different when information stopped flowing toward him. Emily Carter's tablet vibrated again. This time the notification was marked with the highest internal priority. She opened it discreetly and read each line with increasing disbelief. Executive Operations had confirmed that senior leadership was already inside the terminal and heading toward the aircraft. The message ended with a simple instruction. Delay departure until further notice. Extend full courtesy to passenger Naomi Brooks. Emily slowly lowered the tablet, careful not to reveal her reaction. She had no idea who Naomi truly was, but she knew enough to understand that ordinary travelers never generated responses like this. Captain Foster noticed the change in her expression. "Another update?" he asked. Emily nodded. "Yes, Captain. Speak plainly." She took a measured breath before answering. "Executive Operations instructed us to delay departure until senior leadership arrives. They also instructed that Ms. Brooks remain comfortably seated." The captain stared at her in silence. Around them, nearby passengers exchanged puzzled looks. The businessman who had defended the captain earlier shifted uneasily in his seat. His confidence had slowly faded each time another corporate message arrived. The retired teacher quietly smiled to herself. Experience had taught her that patience often exposed the difference between confidence and certainty. Naomi looked toward the aircraft window as airport service vehicles crossed the ramp beneath the evening sky. The fading sunlight reflected across the polished wing, reminding her how many flights she had taken over the years. Thousands of miles, hundreds of meetings, countless boardrooms. Yet the hardest journeys had never been measured in miles. They had been measured in moments when dignity was tested before identity was known. Emily stepped closer to Naomi and lowered her voice. "Ms. Brooks, may I offer you some water or coffee while we wait?" Naomi smiled warmly. "Water would be wonderful. Thank you." It was the first ordinary interaction anyone had offered her since boarding the aircraft. Emily returned moments later with a chilled bottle of water and placed it gently on the tray table. "I appreciate your patience," she said sincerely. Naomi nodded. "Thank you for choosing to verify before deciding." Those words stayed with Emily long after she stepped away. They sounded less like praise and more like a lesson she would carry throughout her career. Near the boarding door, two airport supervisors quietly entered the aircraft, and spoke with another flight attendant before remaining near the entrance instead of walking into the cabin. Their presence immediately caught Captain Foster's attention. Supervisors rarely appeared without advance notice, especially after boarding had nearly finished. One of them briefly looked toward Naomi before speaking softly into a headset. No one else could hear the conversation, but everyone noticed the respectful expression on his face. The atmosphere inside first class shifted again. Conversations became whispers. Phones were lowered. Even those who had privately judged Naomi began studying her more carefully, searching for clues they had overlooked. Yet nothing about her appearance had changed. She still wore the same charcoal hoodie, the same jeans, and the same white sneakers. The only thing changing was the perspective of the people around her. Captain Foster finally realized that the situation had moved beyond his understanding. For the first time all afternoon, he approached Naomi without issuing a command. "Ms. Brooks," he said, his voice noticeably calmer. "It appears corporate operations wishes to review this matter personally." Naomi looked up with quiet composure. "I understand," she replied. "The truth has a way of arriving exactly when it is needed." Almost as soon as the words left her lips, the aircraft door opened once more. Several professionally dressed executives stepped into the cabin with purposeful expressions, and every conversation inside the aircraft came to an immediate stop as I turned toward the entrance. Every conversation inside the cabin disappeared the instant the group stepped through the aircraft door. 4 men and 1 woman, all wearing dark business suits with company identification badges, entered with calm purpose instead of urgency. They did not look toward Captain Daniel Foster first. They did not speak to the gate supervisors. They walked directly down the aisle until they stopped beside seat 2 Alpha. The woman standing at the front of the group smiled warmly. "Good afternoon, Ms. Brooks," she said. "Thank you for waiting. We sincerely apologize for the delay." Naomi Brooks stood for the first time since boarding the aircraft. She returned the smile with the same quiet dignity she had carried throughout the afternoon. "Good afternoon, Rachel," she answered. "I appreciate you coming personally." Captain Foster watched the exchange with growing confusion. The executives spoke to Naomi with the effortless familiarity reserved for someone they respected deeply. Rachel turned toward the cabin before speaking again. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the inconvenience. We are here to resolve a matter concerning one of our most valued leaders." Several passengers exchanged startled glances. The businessman across the aisle slowly lowered his eyes, sensing that every assumption he had made was beginning to collapse. Emily Carter stood motionless beside the galley, hardly believing what she was witnessing. Rachel continued with calm professionalism. "Allow me to introduce Ms. Naomi Brooks, Chief Executive Officer of Brooks Aviation Group, the parent company and majority owner responsible for overseeing the strategic direction of this airline." For a moment, nobody moved. The words seemed to hang in the air long after they had been spoken. Captain Foster stared at Naomi as though his mind refused to accept what his ears had just heard. The young passenger who had quietly recorded the confrontation slowly lowered his phone. The retired teacher closed her eyes briefly, almost relieved that the truth had finally found its voice. Naomi looked around the cabin, making eye contact with several passengers before resting her gaze on Captain Foster. There was no anger in her expression, no satisfaction, only quiet disappointment. "Captain Foster," she said gently, "when I asked you to verify my boarding pass, I was not asking for special treatment. I was asking for the same fairness every passenger deserves." Her words landed with far greater force than any raised voice could have achieved. Rachel nodded respectfully before continuing. "Ms. Brooks regularly travels without advance announcements because she believes the customer experience should be observed honestly. She prefers to be treated like every other passenger. Unfortunately, today provided insights none of us expected." Another executive quietly handed Rachel a digital tablet displaying the passenger manifest, security logs, and boarding records. "Every system confirms that Ms. Brooks was correctly assigned to seat 2 Alpha before boarding began," Rachel said. "No seating error ever existed." Captain Foster finally found his voice. I was trying to protect company standards." Naomi answered him without hesitation. "Company standards begin with respect. Procedures exist to verify facts, not replace them." The simplicity of her response left the entire cabin silent once again. Emily felt her eyes sting with emotion. She remembered Naomi thanking her only minutes earlier for choosing verification before judgment. At the time, she thought it was simple kindness. Now she understood it was leadership. The businessman slowly turned toward Naomi. His earlier confidence had completely disappeared. He opened his mouth as though searching for something meaningful to say, but no words came. The assumptions that had once seemed so certain now felt painfully empty. Rachel looked toward Captain Foster with measured professionalism. Captain, corporate operations will complete a full review after today's flight. For now, our immediate priority is ensuring that Ms. Brooks experiences the respectful service every customer deserves. Naomi quietly picked up her backpack and placed it beneath her seat once again before, sitting down with the same calm grace she had shown from the beginning. Nothing about her posture suggested victory. She had never been trying to win. She had simply refused to surrender her dignity. As the realization settled across every face in first class, the atmosphere changed completely. The woman Minnie had silently questioned only minutes earlier had not become important because of her title. She had revealed that true importance had been sitting among them all along. The executives remained near the front of the cabin, but none of them attempted to dominate the moment. They understood that the most important lesson had already revealed itself. Rachel turned toward Captain Daniel Foster with the same professional composure she had shown since boarding the aircraft. "Captain," she said calmly, "effective immediately, another flight crew has been assigned to complete today's departure. Corporate operations will meet with you after this flight to review everything that occurred." Her voice contained neither anger nor humiliation. It was simply the language of accountability. Captain Foster lowered his eyes for the first time that afternoon. The certainty that had guided every decision since boarding had quietly disappeared. He looked toward Naomi Brooks, searching for words that could somehow undo what had already happened. "Ms. Brooks," he began carefully, "I owe you an apology. I should have verified the facts before making assumptions. I failed to give you the respect every passenger deserves." Naomi listened without interruption. She had waited all afternoon for someone to choose truth over pride. "Thank you for saying that," she replied. "The apology matters because it recognizes what should have happened from the beginning. I hope the next passenger who sits in this seat never has to experience this conversation." Those words settled over the cabin with remarkable clarity. They were not spoken to embarrass anyone. They were spoken to protect someone who had not yet walked onto a future flight. Emily Carter felt herself smile quietly. She realized that genuine leadership was not measured by how much authority someone possessed. It was measured by how many people benefited from one difficult decision made with integrity. Rachel then turned toward Emily. "Ms. Carter, corporate operations has already reviewed your communication logs. Thank you for choosing to verify the information rather than relying on assumptions. Your professionalism reflects exactly the culture we are committed to building." Emily's eyes widened with surprise. "I only followed the facts," she answered honestly. Naomi looked at her with genuine appreciation. "That is how trust begins," she said. "One person willing to pause long enough to ask what is true." Around the cabin, the atmosphere had completely transformed. The businessman who had laughed earlier slowly stood before speaking. "Ms. Brooks, I judged you before I knew anything about you. I cannot take those moments back, but I am sincerely sorry." Naomi offered him a gracious nod. "We all make quick judgments at times," she answered. "The important choice is whether we are willing to learn from them." The retired teacher smiled warmly, recognizing the quiet wisdom behind those words. Several nearby passengers nodded in agreement. The young man who had recorded the incident lowered his phone completely. He no longer wanted to capture conflict. He wanted to remember the lesson. Airport supervisors quietly welcomed the replacement captain and first officer onto the aircraft. Boarding preparations resumed with calm efficiency. There was no dramatic announcement, no celebration, only experienced professionals ensuring that every remaining task was completed with care and respect. As the new captain greeted the cabin, he paused beside Naomi's seat. "Ms. Brooks," he said with a sincere smile, "thank you for your patience. We are honored to have you traveling with us today." Naomi returned the greeting with quiet warmth. "Thank you, Captain. I look forward to a safe flight." Rachel gathered the executive team before preparing to leave the aircraft. Before stepping into the aisle, she addressed the passengers one final time. "We appreciate your patience today. Every customer deserves to be treated with fairness, dignity, and respect. Those principles will continue guiding every decision we make. As the executives exited through the aircraft door, an unexpected sound filled the first-class cabin. One passenger began to clap softly. Another joined. Then another. Within moments, respectful applause spread through the cabin, not because Naomi Brooks had revealed an impressive title, but because she had demonstrated extraordinary grace when dignity had been tested. Naomi acknowledged the applause with a modest smile before taking her seat once more. She did not see the moment as a personal victory. She saw it as proof that fairness could still find its way into a room whenever even a few people chose courage over assumption, and that quiet truth would always travel farther than confident prejudice. The aircraft door finally closed, and a quiet sense of peace settled over the cabin that had felt impossible only an hour earlier. As the engines slowly came to life, passengers returned to their conversations, but something about those conversations had changed. They were softer now, more thoughtful, as though everyone had silently agreed that they had witnessed something larger than an unexpected delay. Naomi Brooks looked out the window as the runway lights stretched across the evening sky. She had flown thousands of flights throughout her career, visited countless cities, and walked into boardrooms where billion-dollar decisions were made every day. Yet she knew that the moments capable of changing people rarely happened around polished conference tables. More often, they happened when ordinary choices revealed extraordinary character. Emily Carter approached one last time before taking her assigned jump seat. "Ms. Brooks," she said with a grateful smile, "thank you for your patience today. I learned more during this flight than I expected to learn in years." Naomi smiled warmly. "Never forget what guided you today," she replied. "Policies matter. Experience matters. But the courage to verify before judging will always matter more." Emily nodded quietly, knowing those words would remain with her long after the flight reached its destination. Moments later, the aircraft began its slow pushback from the gate. The cabin lights dimmed slightly, and the familiar safety announcement filled the air. Everything finally felt normal again, yet nobody aboard was quite the same person who had boarded earlier that afternoon. Across the aisle, the businessman looked toward Naomi once more. This time there was no embarrassment on his face, only respect. He understood that expensive seats, tailored suits, and confident opinions could never reveal the full measure of a person. Character revealed itself long before titles ever did. The retired teacher opened the small notebook she always carried while traveling and wrote a single sentence across the top of an empty page. She smiled after reading it twice. Some lessons deserve to be remembered exactly as they were learned. As the aircraft accelerated down the runway and lifted smoothly into the evening sky, the city lights below became smaller with every passing second. Naomi watched them disappear beneath the clouds before closing her eyes for a brief moment. She was not thinking about the apology she had received or the authority she possessed. She was thinking about the next traveler who might look different, dress differently, or come from a different background. She hoped that person would encounter employees who had learned from today instead of repeating it. Somewhere in the terminal, reports would be written, conversations would take place, and procedures would be reviewed. Those actions mattered, but Naomi believed lasting change always began much earlier. It began inside the quiet decision every individual made before speaking their first word to another human being. She reached for the bottle of water Emily had brought her and took a small sip before looking once more through the window at the endless horizon ahead. Then, almost to herself, she spoke words that only the nearest passengers could hear. The most valuable seat on any airplane is not first class. It is the place where respect sits before assumptions. No one answered because no answer was necessary. The silence itself carried the truth. Outside, the aircraft continued climbing above the clouds toward a new destination. Inside, something even more meaningful had begun its own journey. Several passengers would return home with a different understanding of dignity. One young flight attendant would build an entire career around choosing facts before judgment. A captain would have the opportunity to reflect on the difference between authority and fairness. And Naomi Brooks would continue traveling the same way she always had, without announcing her title, allowing every experience to remind people that greatness is never measured by appearance. It is revealed by integrity, strengthened by humility, and remembered by the quiet courage to treat every person with equal respect before knowing who they are.